Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
2 teams, 1 goal. As the puck drops in the final series of the Professional Women's Hockey League's second season, the league and its players have built a steady and fervent fan base.
Phillips makes the early save.
A sophomore season building the case for even more women's hockey. According to the PWHL, the league averaged nearly 7,500 fans per game, up from 5,500 last season. Helping attract those fans was the so-called Takeover Tour, showcasing the league's talents in 9 cities that don't have teams.
The quality of our hockey is so high and so much fun. So we want people to have the experience live, not just via social, not just via TV. So important for us to get out to different markets for people to see what we have to offer.
The enthusiasm and engagement worked. Next season, 2 expansion teams will join.
We got a team!
Vancouver and Seattle will bring the league to 8 teams. But expansion comes with sacrifice. Those new teams will get the chance to pick players from existing ones. And some cleaning out their lockers aren't sure if they'll be back, including Montreal's Erin Ambrose.
There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of anxiety around it. But I also am really excited because it means that our league's doing something good.
Still, if she is ultimately scooped up,
let's not be the one that cries on media day.
I think that one of the challenges is going to be how to not alienate the fans of the existing teams.
Fans could be disappointed in losing some of their favorites, but teams for now can protect 3 players from the expansion draft.
It's going to be interesting to see how they thread that needle and see whether they can continue that kind of growth, right?
The league thinks it can be done, hoping the growth of their game is just beginning. Sarah Levitt, CBC News, Montreal.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, greetings and salutations, my friends. How are you? It's Tim Hanlon, and it is Good Seats Still Available. Yeah, that's what we like to call it. It's our little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. I am hugely appreciative of you taking the time to find us and download us, put us in your earbuds, and enjoy the proceedings this week. We know you have many choices out there in podcast land, and I'm honored and humbled that you chose to spend some time with us this week as we get into a topic that has eluded us for some time, but finally we have an excuse to get into it. With our guest this week, Karissa Donkin. She's the reporter and insider extraordinaire for the CBC up in beautiful Canada, CBC Sports and CBCSports.com, around the topic, which is women's hockey, the Professional Women's Hockey League in particular, as we celebrate the release of her new book that gets into the story of the now and the before of this league, and obviously plenty of seeds of where it's going to go, we think. It's called Breakaway, the PWHL and the Women Who Changed the Game. It is published by, who's it published by? Goose Lane Editions. Love that title, the publisher. Goose Lane Editions. It's available now wherever you get good books. Of course, you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 414 with myself and Karissa, and you'll find a couple of convenient links there to Amazon, our pals there. And you can get the paperback or Kindle versions brought to your home and as quickly as humanly possible. And by doing so that way, we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love. We appreciate that. Helps keep our lights on and stuff. But if you can't do it that way or want to go support your local bookstore, that's fine too. Just get the book. Because as you'll hear in this conversation, it's a fascinating story about the origin story of women's hockey, the professional versions thereof, how the women's game has grown so quickly and rapidly, especially with the Olympics, as the U.S. and Canadian teams can tell you, and just the underpinnings of what is now a very stable league entering now into its third season with 8 teams now, 2 new expansion franchises, one in Seattle and one in Vancouver, not yet named as we record this, but to join the original 6 in Boston and Minnesota, Montreal, New York, Ottawa, and Toronto, and some of the best names and nicknames and logos and color schemes that you will ever find in pro sports that are part of this professional women's hockey league. And as we'll hear in our conversation coming up in a few moments' time, it's been an interesting and often torturous journey into this level of stability now that this league has come into play and is really solidified with some very strong roots in its first 2 years of operation, courtesy of the investment and vision of the Mark Walter Group. Mark Walter being one of the owners of the LA Dodgers, and Billie Jean King's entity, the BJK Enterprises entity, which also is a funder and founder of League One Volleyball and a bunch of other women's sports efforts and endeavors. And that's all sort of part of it. One of the, we're going to talk about some of the leagues that preceded this NWHL. You may be familiar or remember the National Women's Hockey League. There are actually 2 different flavors of that. We'll talk about that with Karissa in a moment. You may remember the Premier Hockey Federation for a quick cup of coffee, which was the renaming of the second version of the NWHL. But also importantly, you may remember for a little period of time there, the Canadian Women's Hockey League, which was kind of sort of a semi-pro, mostly amateur kind of league that even preceded those things. But importantly, the most immediate thing that preceded this PWHL is something known as the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association, which around, I want to say in 2020 or so, kind of brought the professional women's players together and to their credit, enabled them to have a voice in what they wanted and needed out of a league, for them to kind of put their all their marbles into the pile and say, we'll do this because they had seen the instability and the haphazardness and the frankly the doubts sown by the fits and starts of getting a professional kind of endeavor underway for women to play pro hockey. And sure enough, that's that agreement, that solidification, that sort of, coming together, if you will, of these players with their needs and their wants, was what sold it for the Mark Walter Group and BJK Enterprises to kind of step up and make the investment necessary for the long-term, or at least the midterm survival, to get this league grounded and up and running. And it is off to a flying start. I mean, the fact that there are now 8 teams coming up this season is testament to the fact of not only the investors, but the players who can now feel comfortable enough to make a go out of it and make a somewhat of a professional life and living out of playing professional hockey. And my goodness, the product, very, very compelling, as we'll talk about. Karissa's book really kind of is kind of a following, if you will, of a full season's worth of what happened last season. The Montreal team, before they got its nickname, actually, I think it was the first season. And it gives you a real sense of just how far the women's game has come, what the PWHL has meant to professional hockey, certainly in North America and potentially elsewhere too in the world. The international game, certainly the Olympics, which are coming up obviously this February, and maybe where this is all headed. We certainly know the NWSL on the soccer front, Athletes Unlimited on the multi-sports front, the things that are happening in volleyball with multiple leagues there, and of course the WNBA in basketball. So many, and unrivaled too for that matter. So much going on in women's pro sports, and it's high time that we get into learning more about the hockey side of things. And here's our conversation coming at you now that we have with Karissa a couple of weeks back. Please, as always, enjoy. I think that the whole women's hockey road to professionalism is an intriguing one. And I'm sure it goes, the whole idea about women in hockey in a more professional setting is probably much earlier dated than the period that we're going to be talking about. But before we get into any of that, how about a little background, especially for our audience south of the border, shall we say? Your background,
Sure.
what your pro job is, and how you stumbled across this particular story that we're going to get into leading up for your new book coming out.
Yeah, so, well, my name's Karissa. I live in New Brunswick, Canada. So, the Canadian side of Maine, essentially, for your American listeners who might not be aware of where that is. And I've been a journalist for the better part of 15 years. So I worked in newspapers, and I've worked at CBC, which is our public broadcaster here in Canada, for, almost a decade now. And so most of that time I was working in the investigative unit, so doing investigative long-term projects. That was kind of my day-to-day. And I started working on this book project during a COVID lockdown, to be honest with you.
We've heard that plenty of times. Absolutely. We gave a lot of people a lot to think about during that period of time.
People remember those. Yeah. So back in 2022, we had some pretty strict, border rules here. Couldn't go to other provinces and stuff like that. And so early 2022, I started working on this, maybe late 2021. It was just before the last Winter Olympics. And essentially, I kind of needed something to do. And I've always loved hockey. I've always loved women's hockey. Unfortunately, there aren't very many books about women's hockey. In general, there aren't a lot of hockey books written by women, but there are even fewer about women. And so I just thought if I could write about anything on the planet that I would be obviously really interested in because I'm doing it in my free time, but also could contribute something that maybe isn't there already, what would it be? And I settled on women's hockey. And so that was back. Sorry, my cat's meowing in the background. He's here too.
That's okay. But bring her or him along for the ride. We're happy to have any support people need.
He'll stop meowing here in a second once he gets settled. He's just alarmed that I've moved into another room without telling him. Yep, here he is. So that was back in 2022. So since then, I've actually started working with CBC Sports. So this is, the sports arm of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And we do a lot of PWHL coverage. We do a lot of Olympic and Paralympic coverage as well. So I've been lucky enough to work on that and kind of started working at CBC Sports, just as the PWHL launched. So that kind of worked out and I really love it. But the book has been completely separate and just in my free time. And it's been a lot of fun. When I first started working on it, the PWHL didn't exist. It was something that a number of players were trying to create. So I sort of started following what they were doing. I would go to a number of the showcases that they had across North America and just started talking to players and listening to their stories. And that's really how it got started.
All right. So that's interesting. I think, frankly, just by you focusing a whole book's worth on women's hockey generally and the professional component of that specifically, I think makes you ready the go-to expert, even though the book hasn't even come out as we record this, but very soon.
Well, I don't know about that, but certainly I've definitely spent a lot of time, studying the history. I've spent a lot of time talking to people. And the book kind of traces, it does trace a bit of the history, particularly around why women's labor in hockey has never been valued the same as men's labor in the sport. And, there have been a lot of hockey leagues before the PWHL. The PWHL is not the first women's hockey league, of course, but it is without a doubt the most professional by far. I think every player would agree with that. I think everybody would agree with that. And to be honest, you could write a whole book on the Canadian Women's Hockey League or the Premier Hockey Federation or any number of entities that came before it. But that hasn't really happened. The sports history hasn't been particularly well documented over the years, save for a lot of very passionate journalists, many of whom did it, in their free time and essentially for little to no pay, right? Just because they were interested in the sport and love doing it. So, I mean, I think with that said, it's been really interesting to follow it because it does talk about the history, but it's also forward looking as well. So I followed along through the first season, and that was kind of like documenting history in action, right? Because this league is going to get bigger and things are going to change, and we'll always have this to look back on what that first season was like and the excitement of it and the records being broken and the uncertainty of what would come next. And I think that's pretty cool.
Well, you're on the cutting edge, though, in that respect, right? Because the PWHL, obviously has gotten quite a bit of attention in its, 2 seasons or so now. And obviously the antecedents, though, now actually take on a bigger role, right? So the fact that there was this thing called the Premier Hockey Federation, and there was, I guess, 2 flavors or 2 differently created national women's hockey leagues from the late 90s through, into the aughts, right? To me, I got to think that there's going to be a whole generation of fans that alight to the women's pro game beyond the 8 teams that it is now. And over time, maybe it'll take a few years, will naturally grow and expand with the league and the games and all that kind of stuff and start to say, what came before all this? I mean, this didn't just magically happen, right? So and we've seen this time and time again with all kinds of sports and leagues and spinoffs and stuff. Where in your approach to this season's worth of this relatively nascent league, where do you begin the quote unquote history lesson, and how much of it do you kind of get into in order to get into the main, discussion of the current league? Because I could see you could have a whole volume or 2, like you said, right, of antecedents.
Oh, 100%. And that was one of the hardest parts, I think, is figuring out how far back in time to go and how much detail. There are people who will probably read this book and be like, you could have gone into way more detail about this league or that league. And I think that's true because, like I said, you could have entire books about, this league or that league that came before it and why it didn't work, what it did well, what it didn't do well, right? But obviously, I have to cut it off somewhere because I did want it to be forward looking and I wanted people to read it and, should they become a fan of the PWHL, now they know about this team or that player or whatever. I wanted it to be forward looking in a way. And, not just about the history, though the history is very important. So I did go back as far as the 1800s to Lady Isabel Stanley. So you've probably heard of a guy called Lord Stanley. We know about the Stanley Cup. Well, his daughter played hockey and loved hockey as well. And she was playing on the Rideau Canal with her friends back in the 1800s. And that's as far back as we have documentation that women were playing hockey. Likely they were playing it before that, and maybe we just don't have any documentation or photographs of it, right? So I do touch a little bit on some of the early history, some of the great players, in the 1920s and the 1930s, and a lot of great things that they did, but we can't really quantify because it wasn't, again, as well documented as men's history in the sport. So, the NHL has been around for so long, you can look back in the 1930s and we can say, exactly how many goals this player scored or that player scored. And, those players are in the Hockey Hall of Fame. And we didn't have that for so long in women's hockey. It's still a relatively new thing that women are being inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. So you look at, a player like Hilda Ranscombe years ago, fantastic hockey player. We can't tell you how many goals she scored. We have no way to quantify, just how excellent she was. at the games. So it, it kind of touches on that, and in the sense of here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's how this factors into the way that we've valued women's labor in the sport. And then it kind of touches on some of those previous leagues and, what were the shortcomings with them. And so, yeah, you probably get through about a third of the book of that kind of building up to the launch of the PWHL, and it's all important context, I think. And then it sort of moves forward through that first season. But definitely, I understand that, people will read it and be like, I want to know more about the CWHL. And, I have a whole, thousands and thousands of words timeline of the CWHL and things that happened. And, it just, unfortunately, it's not like a 10,000 page book. I wish, because there's definitely more to say. And, and hopefully, like you said,
with conversations like this, hopefully we'll sell a whole ton of these books, right? So that you can, you can be the authoritative source to do all those, the treatments that all these, but so, okay, there are a couple of things I want to ask before I maybe zone you into maybe 1999, 2000 or so for the, I guess, the abbreviated layman's understanding of the sort of alphabet soup that kind of truly preceded what exists today with the current league. But I guess there are two sort of threads that I'm really curious about that I know are part of the mix here. Number one is the fact that a lot of this seems to be a Canadian story. The idea not only of hockey and Canada being synonymous with each other as the truly proverbial national pastime and all that stuff. But the fact that the women's game feels like it's been disproportionately or maybe solely centered historically coming out of Canada more so even than the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you look at it, right? I mean, Canada and the USA, they've been the two major superpowers in women's hockey. We go back to 1990 at the first Women's World Championship where Canada won, and then 1998, the other sort of notable date in the 90s, I think, for women's hockey was when it made its debut at the Olympics and the Americans won that time around. And, some of these leagues, the Canadian Women's Hockey League, for example, I think people would argue that it was, the best league at the time when it existed in terms of the professional play. And it was called the Canadian Women's Hockey League, but there, was always a presence in the US as well. There was a team in the Boston area. And there were American players who competed in that league. But then you also look at, the growth of women's sports in the NCAA, and that has had a huge impact on women's hockey, just as it's had on, women's basketball and all kinds of other sports. And that is largely an American thing, right? So it's Canadian athletes going to American colleges and, being treated equally to men's sports. And that is the path that all of the best female hockey players take, is through American colleges. So there's some history there in the US, but in Canada as well. And yeah, I mean, I'm also based in Canada, so I'm sure that there's some of that poking through there. I did follow a Canadian team. I followed the team in Montreal, partly because the best player in the world plays there in Marie-Philippe Poulin, and also because it's, drivable from where I live here in New Brunswick. So I see why you would think that, but yeah.
No, not casting aspersion. I was more interested in the fact that a lot of it has a solid Canadian sort of rooting to it. But you touch on the other sort of area, which is this Olympics thing. And we've seen this with time and memoriam and other sports and stuff, right? There's always either there's a professional sort of idea always waiting for the next Olympics for a particular secondary or tertiary sport to prove the case that there is an audience for this thing that comes every 4 years or so.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. It's very interesting. I think it's crucial to the story, right? That the appearance and the success of the women's hockey tournament in the Winter Olympics really was a shot in the arm for whatever thoughts there might have been about coalescing around professionalism for the women's game.
Yeah, definitely going back to the 90s, like we were talking about, 1998, it makes its debut at the Olympics. And I think for a lot of people, that was their introduction to women's hockey I have to admit my moment was kind of 2002. I don't really have a strong personal recollection of honestly hockey at all at the 1998 Winter Olympics. I think that's just an age thing.
Oh,
And
you kids today.
yeah. Yeah, I wonder too. It's funny, and maybe I remember 2002 better because the Canadians won then, and some Americans might have different memories with 1998 there. But
Probably.
yeah, I think it definitely increased the profile of the sport, and we look at it like you said, every 4 years the interest would peak in women's hockey, and there was always this really confusing kind of problem where you would see so much interest and you'd see record viewership and you'd see all these people tuning in. And then the exact same players would go play in a professional league, like a few weeks later, probably wearing the same gear and using the same sticks because those were the only ones they had. And people wouldn't tune in. They were just wearing different jerseys. So that was sort of the problem. And the argument would be, well, nobody's going to watch. We don't have evidence of this. But, it'd be like, well, we do actually know people are interested because they watch at the Olympics. And it really came down to, I think, how the game was marketed and how it was sold and also how easy it was to watch. And I talk about that a little bit in the book. Like the first season of the PWHL was really accessible and you could watch all the games on YouTube. And, we broadcast quite a few of the games on our public broadcasting network, CBC here in Canada. It was really accessible to people. And I think they've done a really good job of having a social media presence and introducing people to the players and knowing who they are and what their personalities are like and stuff like that. And that's what seemed to really be missing from some of these leagues that came before that honestly just didn't have the budget to do as much of that stuff. So that was part of it. And then the other part of it was, I think, kind of this boost in interest in women's sports that's happened over the last few years. And now the media pays more attention to women's sports. That was part of it too, is a lot of the coverage here in Canada, I can speak to for sure. Over the years, when people would write about women's hockey, it would be centered around, a world championship or the Olympics, or league building, or, this league is failing, this league is succeeding, why don't you have a league? Like that's what everybody would talk about. People really talked about the actual hockey that was being played in these leagues. So that was a problem. And I think, now that we're 2 seasons into the PWHL going into the 3rd season, there's a lot of talk about the hockey. There are a lot of reporters who show up, it depends on the market, but Montreal, for instance, where I was spending a lot of time in the first season, like it's not uncommon to have, a half a dozen to a dozen reporters at a practice. That's just normal in Montreal, and it certainly was not like that before.
So, all right. So let's get into more the immediate sort of tributaries that kind of ultimately birthed the current league. Because, and again, I know that it's a little wonky here, but it's in layman's terms, I guess. Can you sort of help our audience better understand a little bit of sort of the primordial ooze, if you will, that sort of came about? The PHF, right, the Premier Hockey Federation, was actually previously known as the Second National Women's Hockey League, but stuff sort of happened that kind of came out of those or that to ultimately come 2022 or so firm up, if you will, what ultimately became the National Women's, the Premier Hockey. Sorry, see now I get confused, right? The PWHL, yeah. Right? So help us thread that needle if you can a little bit.
Yeah. So I think, to kind of walk you through it historically, like let's go back to 2007. So that's when the Canadian Women's Hockey League launches, and it's primarily based here in Canada. And that was created essentially because there was a league before it called the National Women's Hockey League that had suspended operations and didn't resume play that fall. And a bunch of the players over the summer had nowhere to play. And so they wanted somewhere to play. And so they talked to, some folks in the business community in Toronto who helped them write a business plan and all this stuff. And they ended up launching this league. It was never a for-profit league. It was never designed to make money. That became a problem years later, but at the time it worked for what it was. And it did have, the best talent in the world, the best players in the world competed in that league. And so then if we fast forward to 2015, that's when the second National Women's Hockey League, so this one is an American entity, which starts with 4 teams based in the US, that begins play as essentially a direct rival to the Canadian Women's Hockey League. And the big difference here, Tim, is that this league launches and the plan is they're going to pay players. So players in the CWHL did not get paid. They didn't get a salary.
Was it even semi-pro, or was it just nominally pro, or was it super amateur, so to speak, but somewhat organized?
Yeah, so I think the term professional is, I think, a bit controversial in women's hockey because it depends on what you would consider to be professional. So the play on the ice was certainly as professional as you were going to get. Like I said, the best players played in the CWHL at the time, Olympians, things like that. But, coaches weren't, really paid very much. Players didn't have their equipment bought for them. The only people who had their equipment paid for, their training paid for, were people who were part of their national teams. So, Hockey Canada, and to a lesser extent, USA Hockey. And so that was a problem. So it wasn't professional in the sense that they had a job and they had an employer and they had a salary. That wasn't happening, but it was professional in the play on the ice. So that's the way I would put it. So the NWHL comes around and, that's the big allure, is they're going to start paying players, which they do at first. But they end up not being able to pay players as much as they initially said they would. And for some players, somebody like Hilary Knight, for instance, is a player that went over to the National Women's Hockey League. American fans will know her as arguably one of, if not the best female American hockey player of all time, right? She's a big name.
That's even a name I know. So there you go.
Yeah, she's a big deal. And so, before she signs on with the NWHL, she's playing in the Canadian Women's Hockey League for the team in Boston. And, she talks about this in the book. She didn't make any money playing hockey for the Boston team. So she would drive around Boston and give hockey lessons, and she would get, leftover food at a Dunkin' Donuts type of thing. Like, she did not, she was not making a living from the sport. And then the NWHL comes around, promises to pay players, but players generally are disgruntled with not being paid as much as they were told they were going to be paid, and some of the conditions not being what they hoped they would be. So if we fast forward then to 2017, the American women's team, led by Hilary Knight, who we just talked about, and players like Kendall Coyne-Schofield, they end up holding out over conditions, problems with conditions with their federation. And, one of those was that the compensation, one of them was what they were being paid for, their training, even something as simple as the accommodations that they got on the road, or getting championship rings when they won championships. They weren't being treated the same as the men's programs. And the World Championships that year, back in 2017, were supposed to be on home ice in the US. And so they said, we're not going to show up. And they took a page out of Billie Jean King's book here, right? Which is, this is the leverage that we have. And if we stick together, we can be really powerful. So they said, we're not going to go. And they managed to get, all of the players who would be called as replacements to say, we're not going to go either. And so they end up coming to an agreement with USA Hockey. But that's really important, Tim. That's a really important detail in 2017, because if we move ahead to 2019, the CWHL at this point ends up folding. So they ended up starting to pay players based on basically the pressure from this new American league that had started. But they weren't able to pay players very much. They ended up having these 2 teams that were based in China that kind of kept the CWHL afloat, but it was never something where anybody could make a living. So some players, when they were being paid, we're talking about $2,000 a season. Like, it's not a salary by any stretch of the imagination. And so the Canadian Women's Hockey League, essentially, they determined that it's not viable, and it shuts down in 2019. And you look at a player like Hilary Knight, she doesn't want to go back and play in the National Women's Hockey League because she feels kind of burnt from going over there back in 2015 and not being paid what she was promised, right? And so players are at this kind of crossroads where the Canadian Women's Hockey League doesn't exist anymore. The NWHL is a place that, some of these players don't want to be. And so then they create the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association. So that is another acronym, Tim. I apologize for that. It's the PWHPA.
Hey, it's not your fault, and you glided over the PHF part of it too, the Premier Hockey Federation, which was a name change of the PWHL for a little while too. So
it was. That's
kudos.
right, and it's important to note in there, the NWHL had quite a few problems, getting off the ground, and then the league did rebrand, and there were changes there, both in terms of what players were paid and also their conditions. And I think it's largely for a long time, it was sort of viewed as this rift between, some of the players who didn't want to play in the league and, some of the players who did. And really, I think it was, when the PHF/NWHL launches, it lifts up the Canadian Women's Hockey League. And then the players who don't want to play in the new league, they kind of push it to be more professional. So everybody kind of lifts each other up. But nonetheless, in 2019, players are kind of at a crossroads. So they create the PWHPA, and it's essentially a union without having an employer yet. And they say they're not going to play in any professional league until they can create something sustainable that's going to last, where they can be treated truly as professionals and employees. So, and once again, it's taking a page out of Billie Jean King's book, right? Where you use the leverage that you have and you stick together. And so that's what they did. And that takes us ahead to, just before the PWHL launch. So what ended up happening was these players essentially came up with a business plan and what they wanted this league to look like. And they toured all around North America. And they ended up finding an investor in the Walter Group. So, Mark Walter, who owns the Dodgers, now owns the Lakers as well. And, with the help of Billie Jean King as well, she's been a huge part in the creation of the league. And,
right, which is ironic given what you just described as sort of the impetus for the model, right? So that's,
for sure.
There you go.
Yeah, and I think you can connect her back to, every sort of movement and development in women's sport, right? I mean, she played such a huge role in the U.S. women's national soccer team's fight for pay equity as well. So
she's involved in one of the 3 pro volleyball leagues now, and obviously the tennis stuff is legendary. She continues to be a force, but this is perfect. We'll call it timing, but you could not find a better icon to be associated with in the goal of achieving a stable professional league.
Absolutely. I sometimes like to think of her as the fairy godmother of women's sport. I mean, she's involved and her spirit is kind of involved in everything. And she's been a huge part of the PWHL, as well as her partner, Alana Kloss. And they were the connection to the Walter Group, and it was important to them. And that's why it became important to somebody like Mark Walter to make this work. And she ultimately connected the players with this investor who has bankrolled this, now successful and growing women's hockey league. So they bought out the Premier Hockey Federation, as you mentioned, in 2023. And essentially, we no longer had this issue of there's a league here, but then there's a league over here doing this. Like, now everybody is in one league, and it's going to be the best league in the world. And that was one thing that women's hockey had lacked for a really long time. And it was one of the reasons why the Canadian Women's Hockey League ultimately folded in 2019 is it was an issue with sponsors, having 2 leagues. There was confusion, as we talked about earlier, acronyms. So just having everybody in one league and making it the goal to make it the best league in the world and to attract the best talent, not just from North America, but internationally as well. That was a huge part of the goal when the PWHL was formed back in 2023.
So how does this specifically come about? So the PHF was essentially at least something, was an entity, right? So there were teams and there's some heritage and there's some rules and just, the stuff that comes along. There's boxes from the office, right? That kind of stuff, right? But that's essentially what Mark Walters Group and Billie Jean King Enterprises essentially are buying really is kind of that, really, to kind of, I don't know, shut it down and reconstitute it. But at least it's
Yeah.
a head start, right, in terms of structure and a little bit of historical knowledge about how to maybe run stuff.
It is to some extent, though. I think they were pretty adamant that they didn't want to just take these teams and rename them or something. They wanted to start something completely from scratch. And there were thoughts over time, as there were a lot of negotiations before the Walter Group actually bought the PHF and ultimately shut it down. And, there were conversations of would the PWHPA, essentially just merge with the PHF. And that ultimately didn't happen for a number of different reasons. And so, yes, the Walter Group bought the PHF, but they essentially created something totally new in its place. I mean, there were a few employees who did make the jump over to the PWHL, but not very many. And, some of the players, of course, would play in the new league, but lots of players who had signed contracts to play in the PHF ultimately didn't have a place in the new league, which was really tough. And it's something that players in the Canadian Women's Hockey League could have felt when their league shut down, right? It's like this emotional feeling of you're losing something that means so much to you that you work to build. And that's what happened to the PHF players in the summer of 2023. They'd signed contracts and, some of them are planning their lives. And it ultimately, there were these confidential conversations going on in the background. And ultimately those contracts, would never come to pass. So there was some compensation for those players and things like that. And as I mentioned, some of them did find a place in the new league, but yeah, there were some people who got left behind. I think it's important to note that.
All right. Let me also throw in this little idea, knowledge piece of information, right? I think it's also timely around 2023. I want to talk about 2 years ago. At this point, right, we're talking about a professional sports landscape that's very hot and arguably still is, with the advent of private equity money discovering professional sports and properties as, frankly, almost like an asset class. A lot of
Right.
investors circling around, and simultaneously, conveniently, women's sports really starting to really take off in ways truly never having been seen before, right? The National Women's Soccer League, right? I mean, took 3 or 4 steps and leagues and alphabet soups to get to the status
sure.
it was at, right? What was going on with the WNBA, which had its lull, even though it had been around since the 90s, and only kind of stormed back, so to speak. And other things like Unrivaled and that kind of stuff. I maybe talk a little bit about sort of those two threads, the women's sports phenomenon and the appearance of money looking to invest into sports all of a sudden.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right with the timing. It's interesting because we talked about the PWHPA being created and the players sitting out. That happened in 2019, and nobody thought that would go on for a few years. The thought was maybe they'll sit out for one season and, they'll create something new. It won't, this sort of
something better.
Yeah, exactly.
Least,
that it would happen pretty quickly. Of course, as we know, in 2020, a pandemic happened. And so at that time, in 2020 at least, I think people were a little bit scared about putting money into something new. Certainly the NHL was no longer, an entity that they could look to fund this, because they had, lost money and things were uncertain and nobody knew what was going to happen in the world, right? And it is, I think, kind of fortuitous that this league doesn't end up getting off the ground until, late 2023, and then they begin play in 2024, because if something launched in 2020, would it have survived a global pandemic? Who knows, right? But lots of established leagues lost money during that time. So it's interesting that that they end up, launching at that time, but also launching at a time when women's sport is, to your point, booming. And we can look at, women's basketball sort of as the epicenter of that, and women's March Madness growing, and, Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers and those folks. And then also, the Women's World Cup in soccer as well. So it was kind of this perfect storm almost to launch when they did. And you kind of wonder, obviously it was difficult for the players who were part of the PWHPA to sit out for as long as they did. Women's hockey players didn't get to play very much in 2020 and 2021 because, they didn't have these these established leagues that could build these bubbles. And the PHF tried to build a bubble, and, unfortunately it didn't really work out. So it was very hard for them to sit out for as long as they did. And for some players, that was their prime, right? That they're giving up. But it kind of worked out when they launched, that there was sort of this, those two trends, as you alluded to, kind of colliding at the same time and creating a perfect storm for this new league.
Yeah, and having financial backing of substance and having entities. I mean, this is an interesting phenomenon that we're in right now. You wonder if this had been 5 years earlier, or maybe even, I don't know, we could say even 5 years later, if we think about. I mean, I take the approach that maybe we're near sort of the apex right now of this sort of cycle of investment. But I don't think you could have timed a lot of the issues extant here better in terms of trying to get a stable, long-lasting, well-funded, potentially, substantial wage-paying league off the ground than this moment in time, given all these confluences.
Absolutely. And we have so much proof now, right, that people are interested in women's sports. I mean, you look at the valuations of some of the NWSL teams like Angel City FC, for example. You look at the viewership of women's March Madness, and then specifically to the PWHL, you look at, like 20,000 people going into a stadium to watch a women's a women's hockey game. That had never happened before. So we have so much evidence now. I mean, we always knew, right? I see we as a fan of women's sport growing up, and obviously the players and the backers and whatnot. Everybody always knew that the product was good, but it was kind of that prove it type of thing. And I think, nobody is questioning that there's value in this anymore, that you can make money in women's sport. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it is a business, right? I mean, you don't have people like Mark Walter, or any other person who owns a women's sports league or franchise getting involved purely out of the goodness of their hearts. I mean, obviously they care about it, but it's also at the end of the day a business, and they want to make money on it. And they believe this is somewhere that they can make money. And I think that, the evidence bears that out now.
How about the players and their ability to make money themselves, right? I mean, we've seen this time and time again through our historical charting of leagues and startups and that kind of stuff. And especially with sports that are not necessarily embedded in the culture, that require care and feeding to kind of get things off the ground. There tends to be a type of player that recognizes the dynamic at play and the sacrifices required, frankly, to kind of have to work to play, so to speak, or work to live, right? Where, they know that the pro entity in its earliest years is not going to be able to be their full-time jobs because it's so new and unproven, and the investors aren't fully behind it yet, and there's no track record, right? Was the Players Association, I got to think that their eyes were wide open in figuring out this relationship. But it does seem to me they also made quite a bit of headway in terms of something substantial or substantial enough to compensate the players, even though it's so relatively early in this league's existence.
Yeah, I mean, and the interesting thing about the Players Association is they had a signed collective agreement with the ownership of the league when it launched. I can't think of any other league that has had that from the get-go, right? So those conversations were happening quite early. And, so one of the things in that collective bargaining agreement is a minimum salary and also a housing allowance. So, I mean, we're talking about, life-changing money for, I'd say, the highest paid, in the sense that you can make a really good living. We're not talking about NHL money. We're not talking about people making, $250,000 or $500,000 or anything close to that. And on the lower end, we're talking about players who, somebody making, say, $60,000 and living in a place like Toronto. That's not, a lot of money to live on, but then they also get a housing stipend, which I think is a huge help. So it's night and day from before, right? Because you kind of had two classes of players before. You would have the haves and the have-nots. You'd have the players who were on the national teams, who would get that extra funding, and they would get their equipment paid for and their training paid for and stuff like that. And so they could, afford to make it their full-time job for the most part. And then you had people who would be working day jobs. And we talk about people like that in the book. There were plenty of players in the Canadian Women's Hockey League and in the PHF as well, and the leagues that came before it, that hockey was not their full-time job. And, you could argue, is it ever really fair to compare those two players, right? Like one player who it's her full-time job to just get better at this sport, and the other player who's working all day and then, has to go and train at night. So that, I would say, is no longer a thing. I mean, there are still players who have, kind of leftover things that they work at, or they run camps in the summer, or things like that, or they're getting degrees on the side. And, as I mentioned, on the lower end, it's still not a lucrative living. But for the most part, this is the first time we have seen people generally be able to do this for a living in a league as a whole. And I think that's why we've seen the game improve. And you watch the product on the ice, you watch a PWHL game compared to a PHF game or a CWHL game from a few years ago, and it's night and day. It's a totally different product. It's a lot faster. The training is better. They have, professional facilities. They have professional coaches. They have access to meals. That's another thing. They get meals at the rink. That was something that players didn't get in the CWHL. So I think it is totally a different world for these players. Could it always be better? 100%. These players did sign a long-term agreement with the owners, and, knowing now how successful the league has been, of course, the question is, would they like to kind of reopen that and maybe argue for a little bit more? Who knows, right? If we'll see that happen, I think that's potentially on the table in the future. But, I think just to sort of be where we're at now is significant compared to where they were a few years ago.
Well, it's also quite striking that the original collective bargaining agreement, I guess you call it that, right, is for such a fairly extended period of time. I think it's a 7 or 8 year long, kind of beginning, if you will, which is at least it gives the impression of stability, right, where both the league and the investors are trying to figure out how to make this a viable and profitable enterprise. And the players knowing that at least there's something standard in place that's not going to walk away the next year or two in something more shakily constructed.
Yeah, and I think that was, what the players were after. So to your point, it's in force until 2031, I believe it is. So it is quite a long agreement. And, like I said, with the power of hindsight, you might look and say, well, maybe the players might want to ask for a bit more. It's also important to note that the past 2 seasons, there have been reserve players. And so those players don't get all of the benefits spelled out in the agreement unless they're on a contract at the time. So there are players who practice with the teams who have to be ready to be called upon at any point, and they're not compensated the same as other members of the team. That is an issue for the Players Association. So I think, there are always things that are going to be brought up as concerns. Maybe, as I said, we'll see that agreement, reopened at some point between now and 2031. But I think just having that long-term stability, it was just something that players had never really had before. And I think that was the goal of it, really.
And has anybody expressed on either side, probably more the player side than anything else, wariness of this fact that the model is a single entity league scenario versus a franchised one? We've seen that dynamic back and forth over sports history, right? Where the pluses and minuses of each of those. But it seems to me, especially in the modern day, the more fledgling, the more unproven, the more lack of firmness in models previous, having that cocoon of central ownership is not a bad place to start. Maybe not long term per se, but
Yeah. Yeah. And, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see, down the road, some of these franchises be sold to, to personal, like to different people, different companies. I could see that. I don't think that is going to happen imminently. The two franchises that were just added to the league in Seattle and Vancouver, the plan was always for those to be owned centrally by the league. So at this point, there's no plan to sell them off. But, it wouldn't be a shocking thing, I think, in the future. And women's hockey has seen sort of the pitfalls of both, right? I mean, the league that came before the Canadian Women's Hockey League in Canada, the National Women's Hockey League of the kind of 90s and early 2000s, each team was owned by, different companies. I think the same could be said about the PHF to some degree, though there were kind of people who owned multiple teams, but certainly in the old NWHL, there were haves and have-nots. And so it became really hard for the have-nots to survive. And, people had different conditions depending on where they work. So to your point, I think having one sort of central ownership system does sort of get rid of that. All of these teams started with the same footing. For the first time, these players had a real draft where they truly had no idea where they would end up. And once again, there were drafts in women's hockey before, but it wasn't, you couldn't really tell people to go live in X city if we're not going to pay you. So it's the parity in this league has been something we've not really seen in professional women's hockey before. And that's because all these teams are on equal footing. And I know that that's something that's really important. Particularly from the hockey operations side, is having teams be able to compete with each other and having kind of an equal playing field. So there is a benefit on that side of things when we're talking about, central single entity ownership.
yeah, I mean, over time, as a franchise model will take care of that, right? When you give them
Right.
spending limits and caps and valuations of teams and all that kind of stuff, that's obviously going to be on the. And I think especially given just how white hot the attention and the growth of this league and the standard of play has been over its two seasons. How did you approach this book? Was it always going to be on? Well, tell me sort of what people are in store for in the telling of this tale. You said you're with the Montreal, and in 2024 it was unnamed. All the teams were unnamed, right?
PWHL Montreal at the time. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I went into it even back in 2022 before the PWHL existed. And we knew this league would potentially be coming at some point, but the sort of status and timeline and what it would look like and who would own it, that was still up in the air. But I wanted to follow a season in time, and I just really like that for storytelling. It's kind of like, F1 Drive to Survive. I wanted to kind of go inside a season, follow a particular team. That wasn't really possible during the PWHPA because they had teams, but they weren't, people who practiced together every day and stuff. And they played all over the continent. So that wasn't really feasible, but I kind of followed that around, and that ended up being really useful in sort of explaining how the league came to be. And then when the league was created, I picked Montreal just because I think it's a really interesting place in the world of women's hockey. I call it sort of we have a joke in Canada that Toronto is the center of the universe, and I joke that Montreal is the center of the women's hockey universe. Just because it's always been a hub for players, even players who have no connection to Montreal. The best player in the world, Marie-Philippe Poulin, plays in Montreal, and I knew, likely that Danielle Sauvageau would be part of it, and she is such an interesting. She's the GM of the Montreal team and has been such an influential figure. Is actually going to be inducted as the very first female builder in the Hockey Hall of Fame, which is well deserved. So it was a no-brainer to follow Montreal, and I kind of just. It's worth noting I actually don't live in Montreal, so I kind of had to plan when I was going to go and when interesting things were happening. So I went for part of training camp, and I was at the draft through my job with CBC Sports. And then I went for their home opener and kind of part of the first week, and I kind of dropped in essentially every month. So I would have kind of a constant pulse on the team, and I got to a couple of away games as well at Scotiabank Arena in Toronto, and I got to a game in Boston as well. And so it was just kind of, I kind of wanted to just like be like the furniture and just sort of soak up as much as I could. And, it's, I really appreciate that the players and the staff there were so welcoming to me and, talked to me. And, it was, there's so much women's hockey history in Montreal, even the building, Verdun Auditorium, where they train and they practice, and they were playing at the time during the first season as well. It's just full of women's hockey history. They have this display case near where the arenas are, and there are all these sort of women's hockey pieces of memorabilia in there. So it was a no-brainer to pick Montreal, and it was just really interesting to kind of follow their trajectory. And, they didn't win the championship that year, but it was still just so interesting to kind of follow how the first season played out for a team, right? And the ups and the downs and being eliminated in the playoffs and all that stuff. So it was a really interesting experience.
It's pretty astonishing, frankly, how quickly stuff is, not only in terms of like naming franchises and stuff, but we're already talking expansion for next season and that kind of stuff. To what do you attribute that over the last couple of seasons? Is it the NHL relationship, or semi? Is it the women's sports thing? And there's got to be a bunch of different things sort of behind all of it. But I have to think that some people involved in all this even are probably taken aback by how quickly a lot of this stuff has taken off.
Yeah, and it is quite remarkable when you think about it. Like, it's essentially kind of around July 1st that the PHF gets bought out, and 6 months later, this whole new league is up and running, and it is completely different from the previous league. It's from scratch, right? And they have general managers, coaches. They've had a player draft. They've done all these things, right? They don't have team names at that point. They didn't have, logos or anything. That was one of the things that got put aside in the first season. And so that does seem kind of wild, to be honest. And I talked to Stan Kasten about that in the book, and he said, the idea that they had to launch on January 1st, it was a promise that he made to Jana Hefford, who is the executive vice president of hockey operations, and she is in the Hockey Hall of Fame herself as a former player. And she basically said, like, we can't have these players off the ice for another season. We can't just have a full season where they're not playing. People are going to move on and do other things. Some of these players hadn't played in a league by that point since 2019. And it just wasn't acceptable. So they had to launch on January 1st. And, were there things on the business side, particularly with the marketing, not having the team names, some of the merchandise in the very early stages was pretty basic. Were there things
now collector's items though?
Yeah, for sure. Were there things they could have done differently or could have been a little smoother had they had a bit more time? 100%. But something that Stan Kasten always talks about is he sat down with the players and he said, we're going to get the hockey right. And that's the most important thing. And are we going to make mistakes in the first season? 1000%, but we'll correct them in the next season. So, I mean, we do see now, obviously they do have names and they have logos and they have, better merchandise, arguably, things like that. And, working on broadcasting deals and even just finding places for teams to play. When you think about trying to do that in July for January, it's not a lot of time. So it is quite remarkable that it happened. Was it perfect? Definitely not. Are there things that they still need to work on? For sure. And we're kind of seeing it happen again with these two expansion teams. But at the very least now they have a central league structure. Like they had to go out and hire everybody to run a league, right? And they had nothing. Like these teams didn't have pucks. They had to do all that from scratch. And so at least, launching these two expansion teams, they have a central system that can support them as they launch. But it is kind of remarkable when you think about it coming together that quickly. And, I think Stan Kasten himself would probably admit to you, like, was it the smartest thing to do it in 6 months? Maybe not. But it worked.
Yeah, but a guy like Stan Kasten in your corner is not a bad thing either, because I mean he's been through the fire and all of it, through lots of different sports stuff. So I mean, to be honest, it sounds like pick one or the other, right? Like, okay, we don't have team names and that kind of stuff, but we can guarantee a launch and the quality of play will be good, and people will get some checks. That's not a bad trade-off per se, knowing with some advanced promise that next year we'll try to equilibrate all that stuff. Let me ask you this. The 5 of the 6 teams out of the gate, right, were located in former PHF markets. Was there a fear that that this could be the same kind of dynamic playing over again, or was it more, I'm guessing this is where it was that at least there's an established interest in a professional women's game in these markets, that it's worth going in, with the real deal this time versus just creating out of whole cloth, or was it just natural that these markets were, I mean, Montreal and Toronto seem logical. Maybe New Jersey, not so much though, right?
Yeah, I think it was, really historical. Like Montreal, Toronto are, pretty much no-brainers, right? At least something in the Toronto area. You knew there was going to be a team in Montreal. Boston has a long history of women's hockey, both at the NCAA level. Prior to the Boston Pride in the PHF, you had the Boston Blades in the CWHL as well. So, that was, I think, kind of a no-brainer as well. Minnesota has a long history of women's hockey. And so then it kind of brings you to New York and Ottawa. New York, I think, we've heard Stan Kasten talk about how if you're going to be a professional sports league, you have to be in New York. I think that's something that they're still kind of figuring out. So the first season they played, a little bit in Connecticut, and they played a little bit closer to where the Islanders play. And then toward the end of the season, they moved more to New Jersey, which is where they're based now. I think they're still kind of building a market there and a fan base, but the league is pretty adamant that they have to be in the New York area. And then Ottawa wasn't originally part of the plans, and that was actually something that Gary Bettman convinced Stan Kasten and the PWHL that was a market that they should be in. There had been teams in Ottawa in the Canadian Women's Hockey League and the Canadian League that came before it. They weren't particularly successful just because they could never really attract national team players away from those Toronto, Montreal hubs. But the Ottawa team has been very successful, here in Canada. I think there's always going to be that, Toronto, Montreal kind of, have always just historically been the women's hockey hubs. But, they've got a significant fan base in Ottawa, and with that kind of even playing field and the ability to draft players and things like that, I think it's been a success in Ottawa. So I think that's sort of where they came from. And then you look at Seattle and Vancouver, where they've expanded to. Seattle's just, a great women's sports market, both in the NWSL and the WNBA as well. And then Vancouver has kind of had, a growth huge growth in women's hockey and girls hockey at the grassroots level over the last few years. And, you know, obviously the site of the historic 2010 gold medal for both the men and the women at the Olympics. So, you know, that's sort of where they've gone next. But it'll be interesting to see some of these markets that they go to. They visited some places on the Takeover Tour that have never had a professional women's hockey team before, you know, places like Denver, for example. And, you know, they perform pretty well there. So it'll be interesting to see where they go next.
Yeah, it's also they did embrace a little bit, certainly the first season too, a bit of a touring model kind of thing, which is like, you know, what Premier Lacrosse League has done, and some others too, where you kind of go to markets, potentially you nominally, not in this case, but you know, in PLL's case, nominally these names of domiciled teams, but they don't really have, but it's all touring. I mean, they all sort of make, the Big Three does this too, right?
Yeah.
But it also is a great way to sample markets, right? The
Yes,
taste
definitely.
of where you know, people might be interested. I mean, it's kind of brilliant, frankly. And you know, you give up a few home games, but why not to test the waters of other potential places to ultimately root.
Absolutely, yeah. And then you know, you have the opportunity, you know, selling out in Edmonton and Vancouver, for instance, like filling NHL buildings. But it is 100% a great way to kind of gauge interest in that market and just get people in that market talking about the PWHL and, you know, the chance to see it up close, and then they're interested in it, and maybe folks there want a team and they're talking about that. So yeah, it's I expect they're going to be doing it again this season. They haven't announced, you know, where they're going to be going, but I know they've gotten a lot of interest from cities that would like to host a game.
All right, a couple of things before we let you kind of get out of here and promote and all that kind of stuff, because we certainly want people to get the book and delve deeper into all of this stuff, because there's so much going forward that seems to be just going gangbusters in the general direction of this league. Tell me about the NHL's relationship or lack thereof, or quasi, or what is that? There's I wouldn't call it a bromance, because that's not appropriate either. But I mean, there's some support there, right? Either formally or informally or both.
Yeah, so it's not a financial relationship, and you know, it's interesting if you look back at the CWHL and the PHF as well. There would be these kind of relationships primarily with individual NHL teams. So, for instance, the Montreal team in the CWHL was renamed to Les Canadiens. So, you know, essentially the feminized version of the Canadians in French. And it did give off this kind of impression that the NHL team was maybe playing a bigger financial role than they actually were. And the thought was, when the CWHL folded and the players decided they were going to sit out and, you know, until this new league was, you know, they could create something new and sustainable, the thought for a long time was that the NHL was going to be the one to bankroll it. That didn't end up happening for a number of different reasons. One of them was, you know, the PHF still existed, and Gary Bettman was adamant that, you know, we're not going to shut down a league or create something new until you come together. We're not going to get involved at all. And then, of course, the pandemic happened. And so essentially, the NHL wasn't financially involved at all in the PWHL. So there is a relationship there. We know that, you know, the team in Seattle and the team in New York / New Jersey and the team in Minnesota, they do share facilities. So there are relationships in that sense. I know that in the first season in particular, you know, they had some help with scheduling, things like that. As you know, that's one of the things you have to do when you create a new league, is like, oh, we have to make a schedule now at short notice. So I think there have been, you know, there's been a relationship there. We've seen some female players at, you know, NHL All-Star games and stuff like that, but it's not a financial relationship. Like, the NHL isn't bankrolling this. You know, it's an interesting question. Like, will we see a day where, you know, NHL owners own PWHL teams? Who knows? But right now it's more of just a supporting and, you know, helping in the background and assisting than giving the PWHL money.
Well, it could be a prelude to something, right? I mean, you know, it's not a bad place to be, right? Versus having no relationship whatsoever, right? And it's also, I think, extraordinary to see some of these big time arenas being filled up with PWHL games and seeing the NHL has to sit back and look at that and go, there's something here. We got to be at least in the room with it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I definitely think there was a mentality at some point where like the players weren't going to wait for the NHL to fund this. They were going to do it on their own and find their own investor. And that's what they did. One thing that I think is interesting that the PWHL does is they don't necessarily feel like they have to do everything the same way the NHL does it. So, some of the rules.
There are a lot of hockey fans that would cheer that on vociferously.
And and some who I read comments on social media and stuff like that, and some people who are just appalled that people could do things differently. So like the jailbreak rule, for instance. But I think that's actually quite fun, and I believe in one of the NHL player surveys, players have said they'd like to see something like that. So that's if your team has a player in the penalty box and you're able to score shorthanded, you can actually free your player from the box. Like that's kind of fun. I think that's cool that the PWHL is willing to experiment in a way that we, don't always see the NHL experimenting.
Totally agree. All right. I want to get your opinions about where you think this league is headed, but also inject a little bit about where logistically, where the upcoming Winter Olympics play in Cortina, Milan, coming up in February. Is there a collaboration? Is it going to put a dent into things? How's that going to affect this next season? But then I want to get your general take on what the next couple of years looks like for this league.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I don't, it's hard to predict because I don't know that anybody could have predicted quite the level of success that the PWHL had in its first season. I think it's always sustaining that, right? And continuing to grow it. So now it's an 8-team league. Is the league going to expand again next season? How do you, is there such a thing as expanding too quickly? Where else do they expand to? Is it growing the footprint further west? Well, now that you have teams, going further west, well, at what point are players going to, maybe start flying on charter planes and stuff like that? Because they're still flying commercially. So I think, it's just growing pains, and there are a lot of those kind of things to be ironed out. I think, as of right now, depending on, I think how the expansion teams perform this season, I think we will see the league continue to expand. I think that's the plan, is to continue to grow it more. I think it's just been really interesting to watch a lot of the discourse shift to the hockey and just talking about the hockey and not just the league building. That's been really interesting. And I hope that that's, where it's going to continue to go. And we see more, more media talking about the hockey and stuff like that. There aren't very many people who get to cover this league for a living, right? So I'd love to see that continue to grow. And yeah, as we look ahead to the Olympics, the PWHL will take a break for that. We don't have the exact sort of dates of that confirmed as we're talking right now in terms of how long that break will be. But it's written into the collective bargaining agreement that they do have to allow players to, play for their national team. So when we have the World Championship or Olympics or the Canada-US rivalry series, things like that, the league does take a break. Going forward, like with the World Championship, for instance, it's been in April the last 2 seasons. Will we see it maybe moved in the future? So players aren't taking this big break in the middle of the season. That's possible. I think that's something the IIHF and the PWHL are ironing out as we speak. But I think it's going to be a really exciting Olympics. It's going to be the first Olympics since the PWHL has existed. So there are a lot of changes there for how the Canadian and the US teams in particular are selecting their teams. And, players' performance in the PWHL is playing a factor, which is really interesting. Here in Canada, the players would all move to one central location and live together for months and try out for this team. They're not doing that anymore, for obvious reasons, because they're, most of them, 99% of them are playing in the PWHL. So I think, one question that a lot of people will probably have as we go into the Olympics is, when will we see that gap close between, Canada, US, and the rest of the world? I think we've already seen countries like Finland and the Czech Republic continue to get better. There are a number of Czech players in the PWHL, but that's sort of the next frontier, I think, is how does the PWHL continue to grow international hockey, kind of in the way that we've seen the NHL grow it. And yeah, that will be, I think, really interesting to see. So sort of how it lifts these other countries up. And I think you can see a world in the future where maybe it's not Canada, USA in the final, 9 times out of 10, and there are more competitive nations. So I think that's where it's got to be going in the future. That was one of the goals of the league when it launched. And, so you'd have to hope the creation of these kind of international superstars, or more of them, is what's around the corner.
I can't imagine this not being a tremendous tailwind for this league, being this is the first Olympics with the PWHL's existence. Would you say the PWHL is the best pro women's league in the world at this point in its nascency?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, there's not really any competition at this stage. There is a league in Sweden, of course. There are leagues in Europe. There really isn't another league. Unless you count the NCAA, which actually is quite good as well. There are a lot of really good players who will be coming to the PWHL very soon who are playing in the NCAA right now. But in terms of a professional league, the PWHL is it in North America. So that's another problem as well, is if, there's not really a feeder league at this point in North America for prospects to be developed and stuff. So that's a problem that the PWHL is going to have to address. And, you have these leagues in Europe, but the gap is pretty big right now between the SDHL, which is the league in Sweden, and the PWHL. But yeah, there's no question it's the best women's hockey league in the world, bar none.
Many, many thanks to Karissa. Awesome book, amazing topic, fascinating about women's pro hockey. The before, the during, now, and potentially soon to come. All kinds of stuff there for you in that chat, as well as in the book, which is a great read and an amazing compliment to our chat that we just had. It's called Breakaway, the PWHL, and the Women Who Changed the Game. It is from Goose Lane Editions, perhaps the best publisher name we've had thus far on this show, and it is available now wherever you get good books. Or, of course, if you'd like to give us a couple of shekels of referral love, we encourage you to go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just look for the episode numbered 414 with myself and Ms. Donkin, and you'll find a couple of convenient links to either the paperback or Kindle versions of said book. And again, we'll get a couple of nickels and dimes of love there that helps go to our kitty to keep this show up and running. We appreciate that very much. Electricity and lights and all the sound systems and it costs money, this show. Come on, man. We appreciate that. Let's see. You can follow Karissa in many places, most importantly at CBCSports.com, where she is the PWHL insider extraordinaire. I mean, if you want to know what's going on with this league, I don't think anybody's more plugged in than Karissa is. She's got a show on there with her colleague Anastasia Busis, I think is her name. Really just truly up-to-date stuff about the draft and the expansion stuff and what's going on. And that's probably your best locus for her and the league. You can follow her on various socials. On B-Sky, she's at KDonk. That's the letter K, D-O-N-K, kdonk.bsky.social. On X, she's got two handles. One is KDonk, K-D-O-N-K, as well as author_KDonk. So follow her on either or both of those places. I think the book is more touted on her author_KDonk handle, but regardless, just follow both of them, for God's sakes. It's not that hard. And on Instagram, you'll find her at KDonkN, the letter N, KDonkN. So there you go. Lots of places to follow and interact with Karissa around pro hockey for the women. We also encourage you to follow us on various socials. You'll find us on X at the X thing at Good Seats Still. You'll find us at Blue Sky at, goodseatsstillavailable.com. And you will find us just about everywhere else on the socials at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including YouTube, where we stream these shows as well. If you don't like to subscribe and follow us on a podcast feeder or the thing or app, whatever, you can just check us out there. But however you ingest us each and every week, we appreciate your leaving some kind words and attaboys and thumbs up and 5-star reviews and that kind of stuff. We appreciate that very much. And of course, by telling your friends so that they can find the show and tell their friends and so on and so on. We appreciate that. You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And again, our website is goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you can buy us a cup of coffee if you like what you heard. Our little tip jar there. You can check out our sponsors and some merch there and buy the books and check out previous episodes and all that kind of fun stuff. And thanks, of course, as always, to the inimitable Jerry Payne for his audio excellence this week, his knob twiddling extraordinaire. And, of course, to you for listening. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week, and take care of yourselves and others. Until then, bye.